The sun hung low over the battlements of Dragonstone, the waves below roaring with an intensity that seemed to echo the tension within Daenerys Targaryen's council. She stood at the head of a great oaken table in the ancient map room, the painted depiction of Westeros laid out beneath her fingertips. Around her, soldiers and advisors drew in closer. Grey Worm on her right, loyal and silent. Tyrion Lannister on her left, brows knit in cautious contemplation. And then Jon Snow standing slightly behind them, reluctant as always to assume the authority others told him was his birthright. Yet something in the set of his jaw that evening had changed. The discovery of his true parentage, the whispered truth that he was actually Aegon Targaryen, had shaken him even as it emboldened some among Daenerys's ranks. Gone was the simple, stalwart warrior of the North alone. He was now, in many eyes, a contender for the Iron Throne. But Daenerys was not blind to the discord. Tensions had simmered among the lords of the North and Daenerys's followers, made worse by the rumor that Jon might lay claim to the Seven Kingdoms. Tyrion had been the first to suggest a solution too obvious to be overlooked. A royal wedding, he had said in his dry, measured tone, might be precisely the symbol needed to unite our forces. That suggestion had sat heavily between them. Jon did not relish the thought of politics, and Daenerys, keenly aware of how her advisors viewed her increasingly uncompromising thirst for the throne, dared not presume it would solve everything. And yet, there was a certain alignment in it, a statement of unity. She could see in Jon's eyes a flicker of warmth, an unspoken sense that they might be stronger together, not as threats to each other's birthright, but as allies, and perhaps something more meaningful than that. That evening, after the council withdrew, Daenerys remained behind, gazing at the painted table. Torchlight danced over the image of King's Landing, that once gleaming capital now overshadowed by the bright flames of her vengeance and the bitter memory of her losses. In the hush, she did not notice Jon approach until he was at her side. He studied the lines of her face. He found in her expression more than the warlike intensity she so often showed in public. There was vulnerability there, a quiet hope tempered by the knowledge that victory was never certain. With a soft voice, he broke the silence. "If we do this," he said, "then we stand before all the realm as king and queen. We stand for the peace we want to bring. We stand against Cersei as one. But I won't marry if it's a choice you make only for the realm." He paused, searching for the right words. "It must be something you want. A vow like this, it has to be more than strategy." Daenerys lifted her gaze to meet his. She recalled every harsh lesson she had learned about power, every ally who had turned on her, every city she had freed only to be forced to abandon. Yet here was someone who swore loyalty not out of fear or ambition, but out of genuine love for the well-being of the people, and for her as well, if she dared to believe it. Her voice was soft and gentle. "If I marry you, Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, it is because I believe we can save Westeros together. Because I believe you care for these people as much as I do. And because I have come to trust you." She laid a hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. For all the swirl of her titles, the Breaker of Chains, the Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, the Mother of Dragons, she was still a woman, and in Jon, she found someone who did not ask for her throne or her power, but who stood beside her, a calm center in the storm. "Yes," she said simply, "let us unite truly." Their wedding took place on a crisp dawn, beneath the open sky near the cliffs of Dragonstone. The distant crash of the sea was a solemn choir to the ceremony. A few northern lords attended, including Ser Davos Seaworth and Sansa Stark as representatives of Winterfell, though Sansa's face held a guarded neutrality. Tyrion, Grey Worm, and Missandei stood close by Daenerys' side, forming a small, intimate gathering. Arya Stark lingered on the outskirts, watchful, protective of her brother. The old rites of the Seven were invoked by a red priest who had traveled south from the north after the battle against the White Walkers, but it was no grand pageant. Daenerys wore a silver gown edged with Targaryen red. Jon wore simple black, as ever, but had pinned the Stark direwolf and Targaryen dragon together over his breast. Even the subtlety of that gesture was enough to make many watchers realize the magnitude of this union. Two ancient houses, both once nearly destroyed, now joined to form something new. In that quiet moment, when Jon brushed Daenerys' silver-gold hair aside and looked into her eyes, he felt a stirring inside, as if the ghosts of his ancestors were guiding him. He remembered the words of his father, his true father, Rhaegar Targaryen, a man he had never known but whose legacy he could almost sense in that instant. A gentle hush fell over the gathering as Jon slipped a ring onto Daenerys' finger. She in turn placed a band of Valyrian steel around his. Their vows were uttered in earnest, free of theatrical pomp. When Tyrion announced them as husband and wife, a cheer rang out. In the sky overhead, Rhaegal and Drogon roared, their cries echoing off the stony cliffs in wild exultation. They flew in great arcs, as if to bless the union themselves. Even the perpetual gloom that had lain over Daenerys and her cause lifted, just for a moment, leaving in its place a warm, humble sense of hope. Yet beneath the soft glow of this union, the practical matters of war could not wait. Cersei Lannister remained ensconced within King's Landing, her supplies bolstered by the Golden Company, her will steeled by the knowledge that Daenerys Targaryen was now a direct threat. Euron Greyjoy still commanded a formidable fleet, and with the Scorpions designed to kill dragons, the path to taking the capital looked fraught with bloodshed. The new king and queen, though Jon never grew comfortable with the title, set themselves to the grim business of planning the siege. In council sessions that followed, Jon and Daenerys faced an unending stream of warnings from their advisors. Sansa, forever skeptical, reminded Jon of the city's thousands of innocent inhabitants who would be endangered by an all-out assault. Arya, quiet but resolute, remarked that Cersei would use every underhanded tactic to cause Daenerys to lose credibility in the eyes of the realm. Tyrion urged caution at every turn. Grey Worm, who had lost so many of his unsullied to the war against the dead, seethed with impatience to see an end to the Lannister reign. All this Daenerys listened to with a guarded expression, wearing her crown lightly yet with a grave sense of responsibility. It was Jon who became her anchor in those sessions. Whenever she felt her temper flare, when grief for her lost child, Viserion, or the harrowing memory of Ser Jorah Mormont's death threatened to drive her toward fury, she would find Jon's gaze. Quietly, his dark eyes would reflect calm back at her, and she would temper her emotions. She recognized that her new husband understood the brutality of war all too well. Had not he himself led the fight against the Night King? If there was any person in Westeros who grasped the stakes, it was Jon. And in her quieter hours, away from the ears of the court, she confided her fears to him. She confessed how the Targaryen madness haunted her nightmares, how she feared following in the footsteps of her father, the Mad King. And Jon, in his own quiet humility, promised he would never let that happen. As preparations advanced, Daenerys and Jon made a show of unity to the houses of Westeros. Ravens flew to Winterfell and the Vale, to Dorne and the Stormlands, announcing their marriage and seeking allies for the final push against Cersei. Some were receptive. House Martell, newly re-established, sent word of cautious support. Others remained tentative, uncertain whether to back the Targaryen queen or fear her dragons. Jon's parentage changed the conversation. There was no easy dismissal of him as a foreign invader's consort, for by blood, he was half Targaryen, half Stark, bridging north and south. Rumors spread from one end of the realm to the other, that perhaps this marriage would bring the stability the people yearned for, or that perhaps it was but a cunning ploy and the new Targaryen power couple would exact a terrible revenge on all who opposed them. Whispers of 2 dragons are worse than 1 circulated among the fearful. For Daenerys, however, every hour brought her closer to an impossible choice: how to besiege the city without burning it to the ground. Memories of what had happened in Astapor and Meereen pricked her conscience. She had accomplished great deeds, freed thousands of slaves, but she had also shed rivers of blood. The truth weighed on her. War is never clean, and the cost always high. Unlike her father, she did not relish the suffering of innocence. Many nights she lay beside Jon, restless, as he slept. Sometimes he, too, awoke from nightmares born of the Great War against the undead. In that hushed darkness, they often found solace in each other's presence. She would press her head against his chest, listen to his heartbeat, and remember that through the swirl of strategy and bloodshed, there was still love, something bright and pure that offered a reason for all this fighting. She had believed once that her true destiny was to sit upon the Iron Throne alone, but now she realized that perhaps there was room for more than one Targaryen on that seat, so long as they shared the same dream of a better Westeros. Finally, the day came when the combined armies departed Dragonstone for King's Landing. The northern bannermen, clad in thick leathers, marched side by side with the Unsullied in their immaculate ranks. Dothraki horse lords rode in sweeping arcs across the horizon, their braids adorned with bells that jingled eerily in the wind. Overhead, Rhaegal and Drogon soared, black and green wings beating the air, their shadows flickering across the columns below. The newlywed royals traveled amid the heart of this great host. Jon dressed in the black leathers that had become his signature, his cloak pinned with the Targaryen sigil and the Stark wolf, while Daenerys donned a silver-trimmed cloak that matched the color of her braided hair. Scouts returned hourly with updates on Euron's fleet and the Scorpion emplacements on the walls of King's Landing. Everything about this journey crackled with tension, for no matter how large their host, Cersei's cunning and cruelty were legendary. Before they reached the outskirts of King's Landing, word arrived that Euron's fleet had been sighted in Blackwater Bay. Instead of attempting to meet the Ironborn at sea, an invitation to lose dragons to their ballistae, Daenerys commanded a risky nighttime raid. The idea had been hatched in the strategy room by Jon and Grey Worm, with Tyrion's reluctant assent. They would attack from multiple angles, keeping the Iron Fleet's attention split, allowing Daenerys, astride Drogon, to strafe from above with bursts of dragonfire. Rhaegal would be flown by no one, but he would follow Drogon's lead, flanking from another direction. As the sun set, the plan was put into motion. At the appointed hour, the Dothraki screamers feigned a cavalry rush along the coastline, drawing the Scorpion bolts away from the water. Meanwhile, Grey Worm led a small, swift contingent of Unsullied in rowboats under cover of darkness to sabotage the Scorpions on the docked ships. The night exploded with the roar of dragons and the scream of men as Drogon and Rhaegal descended upon the fleet. Bolts sang through the sky, a few too close for comfort, but the confusion forced Euron to retreat deeper into the bay, giving the Targaryen forces enough foothold to occupy key points around the harbor. The next morning found a changed landscape. Smoke rose from the charred remains of several Golden Company supply vessels. Some of the larger war galleys had been scuttled to prevent them from falling into Targaryen hands. Word spread that Euron himself had escaped, though many of his lieutenants were left to burn. Daenerys surveyed the destruction from atop a bluff, her expression grim but resolute. She felt that old stirring within her, the rush of power when the fire of her dragons tore through enemy lines. But she also felt Jon's hand on her arm, grounding her. "We have to keep pressing," he said. "We can't afford to give Cersei time to regroup." She nodded, and together, they approached the city gates. Cersei had barricaded herself within the Red Keep, confident in her walls and her archers. The Golden Company, though bloodied, still formed an impressive shield behind the gates of King's Landing. Tyrion urged Daenerys to attempt one last parley, hoping against hope that reason might spare thousands of innocent lives. Against the advice of Grey Worm, Daenerys consented. She, Jon, and Tyrion rode forward under a white flag of truce, stopping a respectful distance from the city walls. The gates remained shut, but after a time, a delegation emerged. There stood Harry Strickland of the Golden Company, a few Lannister guards, and Qyburn, the Queen's hand, every inch of his bearing oily and self-assured. Tyrion tried to negotiate. He spoke of a peaceful transfer of power, reminding Qyburn that the odds were stacked against them, that Daenerys' forces would soon surround the city and starve it out if a direct assault proved too dangerous. Qyburn, in his usual grave whisper, insisted on Cersei's unwavering resolve. When Tyrion appealed to him to think of the city's populace, Qyburn dismissed the notion. The Queen would not relinquish her throne. Tension mounted with each word, and an uneasy hush fell when Qyburn sneered. "Her Grace suggests you recall what happened to your father and your brother when they dared to rise against the crown. The same fate awaits any traitors, Targaryen or otherwise. Jon, hearing this, felt a surge of anger roil within him. He remembered Ned Stark's execution, the bloodshed that had started the War of the Five Kings. Daenerys, seeing his rage, placed a calming hand on his shoulder. She looked Qyburn in the eye and spoke slowly. "We will give you 1 day to surrender. After that, if the gates do not open, we will take King's Landing by force. The blood spilled will be on Cersei's hands." Qyburn made no reply beyond a slight incline of his head. The parley ended. As Daenerys and Jon turned away, the gates slammed shut behind them, the echo resounding like a death knell across the plain. Throughout that day and the following night, preparations accelerated in the Targaryen camp. Siege towers and catapults were readied, while a ring of infantry spread out around the city's walls. Women and children from the outlying fields fled to safety behind the lines, some welcomed into the camp by the Northmen or the Unsullied. Tents sprang up in every direction, filled with provisions for what might become a prolonged siege if Daenerys held to her vow not to burn the city. She was determined to avoid unnecessary slaughter, though part of her recognized that she could not appear weak. Cersei counted on her enemies' moral qualms. She wanted them hamstrung by their own conscience, giving her more time to maneuver. Daenerys spent hours pacing beneath the high canopy of her command tent, going over plans with Grey Worm and Tyrion, occasionally stepping out to stroke Drogon's scaled neck to reassure herself of his presence. Jon, for his part, tried to steady the anxieties of the northern troops, who still bore the scars of the war against the dead and looked upon the approaching conflict with weary hearts. As the sun dipped below the horizon on the final evening of the ultimatum, Daenerys and Jon met in private. The tent was lit by a single lantern, casting flickering shadows across their faces. The day's exhaustion lay upon them both like a cloak. Daenerys rubbed her arms, as if warding off an invisible chill. She thought of how easily she could end this with one commanding flight upon Drogon's back, how the city walls would mean nothing to a dragon's fire. She thought, too, of the countless mothers and children within those walls who had no part in the war. "Am I too soft?" she asked softly. "Am I letting my father's memory guide me in the wrong direction? He would have burned them all. But I don't want to be like him, Jon." Her voice trembled with a fervor that revealed just how deeply she feared losing herself to the Targaryen darkness. Jon placed a hand over hers and gently squeezed. "You're not him," he said. "You have compassion. You want to break the wheel, not become its next cruel turn. This is why so many follow you, why I follow you. It's not just your birthright, Daenerys. It's your heart." He glanced at the tent flap, listening to the muffled sounds of soldiers moving about, aware that they had only a few hours before the attack might commence. "If we must fight tomorrow, we'll fight, but we do it our way. We take the city without making it a pyre. We'll show them there's a better path." Her silver-gold hair was loose around her shoulders, and she looked more a vulnerable woman than the imposing queen of the Undulls. She nodded. "Promise me," she whispered, "that if my anger ever consumes me, if I lose sight of who I am, you will bring me back." There was a flicker of tears in her eyes, unfallen but shimmering. "Swear that you will never let me become a monster." Jon drew her into a gentle embrace. "I swear it," he murmured. "I'll stand by you." At dawn, Daenerys' ultimatum expired. She ordered the drums sounded and the horns blown to announce the final siege. The massive Targaryen forces, combined with their northern allies, arrayed themselves before King's Landing's walls. Troops took up positions behind newly raised barricades, as the catapults were rolled into place. Archers stood ready to return fire. Rhaegal and Drogon circled overhead. From within the city, no surrender came, only the ominous clang of gates being reinforced and the sight of Lannister archers lining the ramparts. Tyrion approached Daenerys and Jon, looking grim. He had pleaded with them to wait a few hours longer, just in case. "You once told me you'd do anything to avoid the fate of your father, your grace," he said softly to Daenerys. "That includes patience. Let the people see our lines. Let them see that we're not storming the gates in a mad rage. Give them time to realize Cersei won't spare them from war." Daenerys tightened her mouth, but Jon nodded in agreement. "We wait," he said, his voice carrying in the hush of the siege lines. "But not for long. People need to see we're giving them a chance to end this without bloodshed." So they waited. An hour passed, then two, the tension growing thick in the air. The sun rose higher, shining mercilessly on the assembled armies. With each moment of inaction, fear gnawed at Daenerys that Cersei might be up to something clever or cruel. And indeed she was.